Good morning, everybody. Very nice to be in Stockholm. So, as Thomas said, my name's Jamie Dobson. This is what I want to talk about. Strategy, the pathway through paradox. So, strategy as a word is sort of despised in general. It's quite disliked in the world of technology. And I think it's because people in tech are sort of allergic to bullshit. And strategy itself is often a bit bullshitty. And so I'd like to reclaim this word because it's actually got a lot of important and interesting uses. What tends to happen with the word strategy is people's social media strategy is often just about tweeting more. That's not really a strategy. People talk about containerization strategies, but when you prod a little bit deeper, you see that all they really need to do is maybe one day use Docker. That's also not a strategy. And so insignificant things get overblown, and really important things, really interesting things, like containerization, get sort of shrank. With containerization, it's almost always a strategic change because the companies implementing it almost certainly don't have the capabilities. Containerization transcends organizational boundaries. And, like all changes, adaptive changes, positive changes, you're left with winners and losers. So the central paradox of strategy is that organizations might be better off after the change, but certain individuals might be worse off. And this is the central paradox that our leadership teams have to cope with. So the three things I'd like to talk about today, or I'd like to address today, well, the first one is I'd like to define strategy. I'd like to define it in a way that's a little bit enlightening and maybe educational, so we can start to use strategic thinking as part of our work. The second thing, which is very important, is I'd like to talk about the impediments to strategy. What stops strategy emerging in your organizations? And the third thing I'd like to do is talk about how we can overcome those impediments. Okay, so as with all good stories, we don't go forward in time, but we go back in time. In this case, to ancient Greece. This is Odysseus on his ship with his crew. Do you all know the story of Odysseus? He was fighting in the Battle of Troy, I think, and then he was going home, and he angered the gods, Poseidon, I think, specifically, and he was blown off course. And thus began a 10-year journey to make his way back home. And there were a sequence of different adventures, and one of the adventures was this sort of moment with the sirens. So the sirens were these beautiful enchantresses. They sang beautifully, but they sang so beautifully, in fact, that people would steer towards them and then end up shipwrecking themselves on the shore. Now, Odysseus wanted to listen to the music. This was his goal, right? But there was a clear challenge laid out in front of him that if you go and follow this to its natural conclusion, you're going to crash and you're going to die. His solution to this was twofold. The first thing he did was they got some sort of cloth and wax, and he put it in the ears of his crew. And then he got them to tie him to the mast so he couldn't move. And he said, under no circumstances, must you untie me from this mast. And then they sailed past the sirens, he got to listen to the music, and everybody sort of lived happily ever after. You have to think he's some sort of awesome leader, right? How did he convince his crew to do that? What was in it for them? Yeah, absolutely nothing. But you start to see the roots of strategy in this story. So the first thing is that strategy is built into a lot larger narrative. So you never win. Strategy is much more like a soap opera than it is a romantic novel. So if you think of a book with a beginning, middle, and an end, that's not strategy. When you think about strategy, think Game of Thrones. You sort of resolve something one week, but next week you're back in the shit again. So we've got coalitions. We've got an understanding of the present moment, which is known as situational awareness. You've got the ability to work with other people and self-supporting actions. This is very, very important concept in strategy. If you put wax in your ears, but then you go to fight the Minotaur, these actions don't support each other. Now, this might sound strange, but you do see, for example, operations departments doing extremely good work, development teams doing the same thing, but those actions can possibly oppose each other. So the actions have to be supporting. Now, we're still not quite there yet, because there's another element of strategy that is also very important. Do any of you know this famous Norwegian company? So the final element of strategy, if you go to do an MBA and you get to do Michael Porter's 5-force analysis, you might think you can analyze IKEA, and you might come up with something like this. The locations of the stores are outside of the cities, so the rent's a bit cheaper. The customer segment is young, upwardly mobile families who are a little bit cash short. They don't mind being part of the creative process because they assemble their own furniture. But this analysis, as Adrian mentioned yesterday, will only tell you the results of the strategy. So this is not strategic analysis because it gives us no indication as to how IKEA put that together. To understand that, you've got to go back in time and start to see that there were lots of distributors and manufacturers who refused to work with IKEA, right? Because they were so cost competitive. What they ended up doing was outsourcing manufacturing to Poland, where there was a group of furniture makers who would work with IKEA, and this gave birth to the flat packing of furniture as we know it today. The flat packing was a good example of prosumerism. You know what a prosumer is? Somebody who produces and consumes their own goods. So we talk about YouTubers being prosuming, you create content but also consume it. So IKEA are smart because the people involved actually end the manufacturing process. The manufacturing process doesn't actually finish until you get to your house. Fast forward a few years from the flat packing innovation and you get to a change in the VAT laws in Sweden. Nobody here remembers that, do they? No. So I think in the 1970s the VAT laws changed and Swedish people, like English people, don't like spending money they don't have to. So I can imagine there was a bit of a powwow in houses across Sweden. Let's spend our savings, let's get some furniture before the VAT goes up. At the time, IKEA was a mail-order company. They could not service the demand. So they said, look, hey, we can't give you all this furniture right now. Could you mind driving to the depot and you can pick it up yourself? And since you all drive Volvo station wagons, you know, we should have no problem moving this stuff around. Okay, fine. So far, so good. I think the IKEA management team panicked because like, oh my God, these people are driving from all over Sweden. They'll be hungry. What should we give them? Let's give them meatball and chips. And so in a moment overnight, the idea of the warehouse becoming the shop, the meatball and chips and the prosumerism started to take shape. So as well as the situational awareness and the goal setting and the challenges that we saw with in the story of Odysseus, you start to see that strategy is a process too. And this is really important. And it's a combination, this is Mintzberg, 1983. Strategy is a combination of deliberate thought, your intentions, you know, what you know about the marketplace, what you know about yourself. And strategy is always much more about asking the question, what's going on now, as opposed to where do we want to be? It's these intentions that form your deliberate strategy, and yet, through the passing of time and sort of things that are happening around you, emergent strategies start to rise up. It's the emergent strategies when they meet the deliberate strategies that gives us realized strategy. This is the thing that really, you know, we think, wow, this was awesome. 3 very important points with this. So on the one hand, you have to have some sort of intelligence, some sort of cognition to come up with these ideas. On the other hand, on the next moment with emergent strategies, you need to maintain an open mind that things change. If you don't do that, you will never see. I mean, imagine, for example, the guys at IKEA saying, well, why do we have to feed them, right? So they change an adversity into an opportunity. The third thing you need is good judgment. This is a characteristic of all strategies. The wisdom to know what to reject in the case of non-realized strategies, and the wisdom to know what to bring in terms of emergent strategies. So it's an ongoing cognitive process. Unfortunately, people think because strategy is emergent, that it will emerge naturally. But actually, that's not true. There's loads of ways to kill strategy. Bad management, misjudgments, and basically, you can come to a situation where what you intended becomes exactly what you get, and yet it's never quite fulfilling. It's never quite right. This leads to what we call failed strategies. So, what are these impediments? So the 3 things, so we work a lot with programmable infrastructure, containerization at all different levels in organizations. And on our travels in the last couple of years, we started to see that these 3 things are sort of the key impediments to emergent strategies. Was that your phone, young man? Or my phone? Yeah, okay. We see that so there's these three impediments to strategy: leadership, infrastructure, finance. And they're bad enough on their own, but they actually conspire to sort of form an even worse situation. So the problem for the strategic leader in terms of leadership is this idea that people get hooked on beliefs. People believe something, a certain way of working, and they don't like to change. So often organisations consist of planners, people who want to think and do stuff in order, and you have people who are sort of interested in emerging properties. So these are the agilistas, the people who like the stand-ups and the retrospectives, and they don't do much thinking, they just get started and they learn as they go along. Ideologically, these two camps are very different. And as the quotation says, what people tend to do when confronted with an idea that sort of pushes back against their beliefs, they will ignore it for as long as possible, and then they will dismiss it. So after saying, I'm la 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 la, I'm not listening, then they say, well, that's bullshit. So it's bad enough that you have beliefs in your management teams, but when you're introducing new technology, you also have a different set of beliefs in the people. So we believe in virtual machines, or we believe in using Puppet for spinning machines up. So the leadership teams have to somehow navigate these conflicting belief systems. And the problem really comes down to this. So F. Scott Fitzgerald said something like, the test of a first-class mind is the ability to hold two competing ideas in your head and maintain the ability to function. So what the key for emergent strategy is to understand that action and thought, planning and emergence have to coexist in order for that to work. And that begins with the coexistence in the minds of people. Now, since that we don't all possess first-class minds, that's almost impossible, we need to sort of surface this and make this a central part of our work. So that's leadership. The second thing is infrastructure. So strategy is partially to do with looking outwards. If you work in a company that's invoicing system doesn't work, that's overcome with bureaucracy, where you manually patch all your different systems, it's extremely difficult to lead strategic changes, to do something that's, transcends organisational boundaries. And that's because you might have a load of first-rate minds, and you might have brilliant leadership, but if they get sucked into infrastructure, you will never, ever know. And the story I like to tell about this is that of the monkeys from MIT. Does anybody know this story? I've heard a version with bananas. Yeah, so I don't know if this is a true experiment. There's a part of me that really hopes it's not true because it's a bit sadistic. But they chuck a few monkeys in a cage with a trapdoor at the top where they can escape to freedom. But they electrify the trapdoor so that when the monkey touches it, it gets an electric shock. So the monkeys are in the cage, and one of them climbs, touches the trapdoor, charges himself, and screams and falls back to the bottom of the cage. So then the next monkey tries it, and the next monkey tries it, and they all learn very quickly that this trapdoor doesn't work. You're going to get hurt. Then the experimenters put a different monkey in. Right, the monkey climbs up the ladder, and the three original monkeys, they grab him and they stop him, and they speak in monkey language. I don't know what they say. And that means, right? Don't touch the trapdoor. You're going to get electrocuted. Anyway, so they bring in a new monkey, but they slowly rotate out the existing monkeys. And after a while, the cage is full of monkeys that have never been electrocuted who don't go to the trapdoor. It gets worse for the monkeys because the experimenters turn the electricity off, and they still don't leave. That's culture. That's how culture gets communicated across from peer to peer and intergenerationally through the ages. The problem with infrastructure is if you have a culture of fixing, of patching, often people take pride in that, especially in the finance industry. We keep the bank running, they say. If you have a culture of fixing, you'll never have a culture of sort of value creation because it's all you've known, right? So not only would infrastructure stop your leaders doing their job, but you create a culture where people think changing stuff isn't what we need to do. And as Adrian pointed out yesterday in his keynote, very, very hard to change a culture once it's embedded. So the third problem is to do with finance. And finance doesn't kill strategy because we don't like spending money. It's how we spend money and when we spend money. So we've probably all been in situations where we know we need to create the continuous delivery build at the beginning of the project, but somewhere in your mind you think, oh, is it really worth putting 4 engineers on that for 2 weeks? That's like 50,000 euros. And the reason we think like that is because we always discount the future. So we know that activities we do now have got future value, but we discount them. Do we really need the build? Do we really need to do the marketing? And because of this peculiar quirk of being a human being, we tend to avoid doing things. Now, the 50,000 euros you could have spent to fix the build then, and you chose not to do, sort of leaks, right? And the problem is 6 weeks into the project, you're like, well, I know we should have fixed it then, but we're 6 weeks in now. So you have this continuous discounting, right? And over the period of the project, you spend much more than the original 50,000. So what has finance got to do with strategy? The way you choose to spend, your spending patterns, has got something to do with how you generate knowledge. So when you create a build and change it into a load of scripts, you're codifying your knowledge, you're encapsulating it in code, and then you're moving on. Once the value is in your organization, you start to rinse returns from it straight away. But if you're not willing to make that investment, you can never rinse the value out. So there are some peculiar patterns around finance that impede strategic changes. But it's the interplay between these three things that are the most important thing. And poor spending habits leads to poor infrastructure, poor teams and organizations that are falling down. Poor infrastructure becomes a sort of dark center that drags in all your leadership talent. So the top team does the team of the managers does the team of the value-adding workers, and the value-adding workers are just sort of holding the ship together. In organizations like this, it's almost impossible to do anything of sort of substantial value or change. So, how long have I got left, please? Anyone? Hello, Thomas? 20 minutes, just checking, because there's no clock here. So how do we get through these paradoxes? So the first thing I'd like to share is this idea of how do we balance responsibility and duty. So the principle that we teach to some of our customers, those who will listen to us, and the principle that we run container solutions on is the donut principle. You will notice that this is not a European donut, it's an American one. It has a hole in the middle instead of jam. And it's the hole in the middle where we think about what our job description is, what are our duties. But it's the outer rim of the donut that serves as a reminder that we are working and we are doing stuff that is greater than our duties. I'm the father of 2 young children. I'm at my best as a dad when my donut is in balance. When my central duties are there, you know, provide for the kids, cuddle them and stuff, you know, play. But there's lots of space for spontaneity, for joy, to sort of do what I like on a day-to-day basis. So when it comes to creating space for emergent strategies, we have to create space around ourselves, around our workers and around our managers. When I'm talking to managers, I try to set this up. Your core duties are to engage in conversation, to look for emergent strategies, but also to think about where we're going, to keep yourself going, to keep your teams going. The rest of the space is where you can be yourself, where your autonomy exists. This starts to go really wrong when you get a donut that looks like that. So this is a donut that's too full, right? There's not enough space for spontaneity, and there's much too much, the dutiful activities are just simply too full. As a child, I was raised Roman Catholic. We went to church on Sundays. I went to a Catholic school, had Catholic parents. Rules, lots of them, dictating our whole childhoods. Myself, my brothers, and all the people at school, we expressed ourselves, we became autonomous by breaking rules, either passively, smoking behind the bike sheds, or, you know, aggressively, fighting in the playground. I didn't see this pattern of behavior again for about 15 years until I started consulting for large organizations, right? Yeah, where you see passive aggression constantly. So it's bad enough that people are ideologically wedded to planning or emergence, but they express their autonomy by blocking each other. And it's frustrating when you see it, and your first impulse is to, blame the person. We call that victim blaming. What a tosser. But it's not true. It's a systematic effect. So passive aggression is a side effect of donuts that become too full. I met an architect once, software architect, not a real one, and he said to me, developers are so stupid, right? So this is what I do. I give them no space. I create the frameworks. I create the templates. The Java classes, that's how old I am, the Java classes are all abstract, and they're all strategies or policies. And all the developer's allowed to do is extend the abstract class and override the abstract methods. I've even got a code checker, he said, so I know if they've added stuff that shouldn't be added. This is an example of donuts that are too full. I said to this guy, how's that working out for you? Dickhead. And the concept of a dickhead is really important in strategic thinking, because what is a dickhead in this context? A dickhead is somebody who tries to control something that isn't theirs to control, right? And that's it. You have to understand, you have to negotiate across your whole organisation, what are your duties and what is your space. Now, the opposite of the full donut is the donut where your duties are too small. And in this situation, chaos reigns. So this is where we dedicate ourselves too much to emergence, and we don't think enough, right? I remember when I first started doing test-driven development, it was something I was really interested in, but I never understood why people further on in their careers than I insisted on exploring the design space to problems I already knew how to solve. So I found that to be a complete waste of time. And I think looking back, I was probably right. So what we're talking about really is the donut is a conceptual way of relating duty to responsibility. There's no magic involved here. All you need is a whiteboard and a pen and a conversation. And it's about making us think about, flexibility and commitments. What is it we want to achieve this week? So I think most people at Container Solutions have got an extremely good idea of what they're expected to do, with lots of space where they can express themselves. Okay, finding financial balance. This is an interesting one. So a lot of time people are afraid to spend. And they're afraid to spend because they discount future activities and they're not sure if they can rinse value out of the activities that they're doing. What I try to encourage people to do is to try stuff anyway. If you can, build things in pieces, components, blogs, pieces of research. But if it doesn't work out, the bucket is a really important tool. What you do is you take the thing that didn't work and you chuck it in the fuck it bucket. Oi! Right? And the fuck it bucket is an important concept because it frees people from worrying about what they're doing today. Now, on the one hand, you think, well, the bucket sounds like a pretty expensive way to give people autonomy. There's another side to the bucket. There's only a matter of time before you find yourself back in it, looking at stuff that you did last year, 6 months ago. There's a cup, Docker security book, and 2 T-shirts. There's a company from Fastly. Who's medium? Medium? No mediums? Extra large, sorry. Extra large. Oh, okay, so the fuck it bucket is very important because it uncripples us, it unsticks us, and it's a nice reminder that the stuff you do today does have future value, and just because you don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So this is a way to get us unstuck. The other way to get unstuck is by trying to find balance in Stoicism. So Marcus Aurelius is my favourite philosopher. Many excellent quotations in his book of Meditations, but the one that's most important to sort of strategy, remember that strategy is about actions, is this one. The impediment to action becomes the action, what stands in the way becomes the way. When we started Container Solutions, it was very obvious everything was broken. All of our infrastructure, all of our invoicing, because we're a startup. All we did is work through every single problem one at a time. So November was the month of admin. December, the month of the message. January, pushing the message out. February, branding. We sequentially worked through everything that we're struggling with, all of our obstacles, and it doesn't seem like much, 1 month at a time, but when you do continuous improvement over a 12 and 18-month period, they compound to sort of fantastic results. And Aurelius, just like the bucket, helps us to get moving. And that's because strategy is not about thinking, it's about action. And that's what we often fail to grasp. Okay, finding balance to yourself. On our travels through different organizations, we started to see archetypes, different types of strategists in different types of companies. This is the ultimate strategist. So we saw that strategy itself was about goals, challenges, risks, situational awareness, but that doesn't tell us anything about what the strategist needs to do or what makes up a good strategist. There's a few components. Empathy. You need to understand the people you're claiming to represent, right? So that's why we have empathy. We saw empathy with the monkeys, right? They stop each other climbing up the ladder because they don't want to get hurt. There has to be situational analysis and awareness of what's going on, right? Your current reality. Typically, you need imagination because strategy is about understanding the current state and trying to dream up a future state. Human beings are unique in this, that we can reason about the future. You need a voice because you need to speak to people, work with your coalition, and you need a vision for what the next state might be. Now, I showed this to a team of executives, and I said, who recognises this in themselves? And a couple of hands went up, and I was like, okay, make a quick note of those people. Self-awareness is also part of being a good strategist. Not many people can do all of this. A much more common archetype is this, the fantasist. And it took me a while to put this together. So my first observation was, wow, there's a lot of fantasists where they have a big voice. And in the hierarchy, your voice gets bigger because, people listen to you. Great imaginations, often a vision. Where, we're going to become I don't know how many times I've heard this. We're going to become the Netflix of the Netherlands. And I'm like, that's funny because, they stream videos and you're a bank. Okay, but that's fine. That's a good idea. And they saw Adrian's talk, and we want that. Our strategy is to do microservices. And I say, you might have seen Adrian's talk, but were you actually listening? Because he said it's the way of thinking. That's core. Microservice is a side effect, a result, just like the meatballs from IKEA. It took me about 2 years to understand why the fantasist exists. Working in a large organization is difficult, right? And when we're having a bad day, your mind moves to the future. Whether it's the near future, oh God, I can't wait for a pint tonight, or the distant future, I can't wait till I retire. So you start to see that fantasists always come along with dysfunctional organizations. So I start to think of the fantasist as a sort of an escapist. This was a very common archetype we saw. Does anybody relate to this? Yeah, one hand there, brave man. The angry engineer is good. The angry engineer understands the people that he or she is working with and actually probably does represent them. They've also often got a very good grasp of reality, although there is a tiny bit of reality that they don't get, which is the reality that people don't like to be shouted at. And yeah, right? And your coalition has to be inclusive. You can't be a coalition of engineers or operations engineers without any management, right? Management is power. So if you want to complain all the time, great. If you want to instigate change, you need to form coalitions. It turns out that there is a little bit of hope in these archetypes. Basically, it's because if you take the fantasist and do a merge with the angry engineer, you do get to something that looks like that. There's a reason companies have CEOs and CTOs. There was a reason Winston Churchill worked with Clement Attlee, right? So the actual forming of the coalition starts with self-awareness. That's why when I asked those executives who's a strategist, and 3 of them said, yeah, I'm that, I'm thinking, there's no way I'm stood here if you're any good at strategy, right? You wouldn't have called me. So they've So self-awareness is the very first thing. So that's an ability to look inside. That's a sort of situational awareness for yourself, knowing what you're good at, knowing what you're bad at. So then you start to build a small team around yourself, and from that small team comes a broader coalition. Okay, this brings me neatly to my conclusion, and fingers crossed a few questions after that. What is the strategist then? So the strategy is really an outside man, a man of thought, and a man of action. And I truly believe that we get strategy wrong because for some reason we think it's only about thinking. We think it's about Michael Potter's 5-force analysis. We think it's something to do with business schools. It's got nothing to do with business schools. It's got nothing to do with MBAs. It's got much more to do with the adventurousness of Greek heroes. That's what strategy is about. And actually, you can be a great strategist without even hearing the word. So really, it's about finding this balance between thinking and action and looking outwards. Looking outwards to your teams, looking outwards to the market you're in. You cannot look outwards when your infrastructure's falling apart. It's impossible to do strategy in an organization that's falling down, right? If your organization's falling down, that is your obstacle. That's the next thing you have to fix, right? So we don't need to dream about microservices. When it takes you 3 weeks to do a release, that's putting the cart before the horse. Right? That's fantasy. What is it really about then? So strategy done right is about new states and old states. And when you're going from an old state to a new state, you have to learn something. You have to master new tools, new technologies. So it's partially, but implicitly, to do with mastery. It's also to do with autonomy. When you get your donuts right, when you leave space for emergence, you create space for people to be themselves. And their energies get driven to value-adding duties and not aggression or passive aggression. And through the deliberate strategies and the intentions, we have purpose. So modern psychologists are now telling us what Marcus Aurelius could have told us thousands of years ago, that these three things compound to create extremely motivated teams. And it's through this space and through this thinking we get creativity and engagement and excellence. Thanks.